Welcome to the Dreamboat. Remember, you can join the DRI for just £10 a year until the end of June 2023. And you get access to more content, including videos and discounts for our events. It's a great way of finding out more about our work, joining our dream community, and supporting this podcast. Details are in the show notes. Welcome to the Dreamboat podcast, a place where we talk about everything dreamy. All you wanted to know about dreams and where you might find some answers. My name is Dave Billington, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm also director of the Dream Research Institute. And I'm joined by fellow psychotherapist Laura Payne.
Hello, I'm Laura Payne, and I'm also part of the Dream Research Institute. And we're called the Dreamboat because we are actually recording our podcast on a beautiful canal barge here at Little Venice in London called the Boat Pod.
We'll be looking at dreams, talking to guest experts, and answering your questions.
Now, let's get on with the episode.
If you've been listening to the podcast, you'll have heard us mention the waking dream technique or the waking dream process, which is an essential part of our approach to dream work at the DRI and our experiential dream work courses. It's a method of revisiting a dream to help the dreamer creatively unpick its meaning and its effect for them.
Yes, the waking dream technique is something that both you and I, Dave, were taught when we were training to be psychotherapists. And I must admit, it's a staple part of my practice because it is such a dynamic and exciting method for interpreting what a dream means on a deep and personal level for the dreamer.
So today we are excited to welcome back on board at the Dreamboat Dr. Nigel Hamilton, who has been the main developer and proponent of the method as a founder of the DRI and a founder of the leading psychotherapy school CCPE here in Little Venice in London. So welcome back, Nigel.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I look forward to your questions.
Well, let's jump right in then. So first of all, can you describe the waking dream process?
The waking dream process differs from the more traditional way of looking at dreams, which is to tell a dream and then the therapist or analyst would analyze the dream. Now, the problem with that is that the client or the patient doesn't have much input. That might vary, perhaps, of course, depending on the therapist, but generally speaking, the input comes mainly from the therapist. Now, in the waking dream technique, it involves a collaboration between the client and the therapist working together, and the medium is not just the dream, but the medium is the client's ability to imagine and also to sense or have the felt sense in the body as they're working with the images. In other words, the images actually are felt in the body. Mm-hmm. There's no separation between body and imagination or body and mind. And you think of people like Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. The body actually knows what it's holding, even if you don't know. And the whole point of the waking dream process is that it gives us a much more in-depth exploration of the dream. It's not just a visual exploration, but it is a felt sense exploration through the dream body, which was first named by a man called Arnie Mandel. Oh. He would take groups and actually have them act out the dream body in a psychodrama, and then that would lead to some kind of insight or resolution. So what we're doing is actually interacting the therapist and the client together. And so the therapist will guide the session through the dream and ask for the client's experience. In other words, what are you experiencing now? Not just in terms of what you're seeing, but what is the felt sense? And once we have the felt sense, then we ask the next question, whereabouts in your body do you feel that? Or if there isn't a felt sense yet, or if it's too vague, we might say, whereabouts would you place the image in your body. So it could be in my heart, it could be in my stomach, it could be in my hips, it could be in the back of my shoulders. So that gives us a starting point, because the dream itself is a journey. In dream language, we say it's a narrative. The dream describes a narrative. But in fact, it is a journey. It's a journey that you're going through during your sleep, whether it's daytime or nighttime. It's a journey that actually moves through your body, but it moves to the subtle body, see? And so by locating where the images are at any point in the dream, you can see what's happening to the energy body. In other words, and so when we talk about the energy body, we're talking about the chakras, the subtle energy centers that correspond to the different parts of the body, like the different organs of the body.
I was thinking in many ways that this is very similar to some of the old shamanic techniques of taking the dreamer through the journey of their dream.
Exactly. It is very similar. And in fact, this is one of the things one has to be aware of as the therapist or the dream worker, is that you're going to pick up in part or fully whatever the client is experiencing. And so you might pick up a headache because there's a battle going on in the mind, a real intense struggle. You could pick up a deep depression because the person actually is feeling very depressed. So I would say that you have to be aware of that and be conscious that otherwise you could start walking around carrying several people's psychopathologies in yourself.
On the other hand, I mean, as somebody who uses this in dream groups and with clients, that is how it works in that relationship between the therapist and the dreamer, that you have an empathic response or an empathetic response to the feelings that the other person is bringing, even if they're not fully voiced.
And that's what the shaman experiences. They take on the so-called, they call it an illness. They take on, we call it the pathology, and they work with it in themselves with their own healing technique. What we do in the waking dream work is actually work with the client in suggesting or making helpful suggestions of how to be with the experience, you see. In other words, to hold the experience or to bring something fresh, like a helpful image that would enable the client to stay with that experience, particularly if it's unpleasant.
Do you have an example of something recently or one particular waking dream technique that sticks in your mind?
Well, I remember a case of a woman that I was guiding in a waking dream, and her experience was she had experience of being terrified of a sort of a black emptiness, see? And in the dream, she began to see what the black emptiness looked like. It looked like a vast, big chasm or pit, and she was terrified of it. And so what we did was we worked with this image. In other words, she held the feeling, the felt sense in the solar plexus. In fact, in the near the sacrum area. And the reason why she was holding it there is because the issue centered around the feminine and sexuality. So that was one of the clues I had, that I knew she had this problem. And so it made sense that she felt it down at that part of the body. So then I encouraged her to imagine both of us descending into this pit. And then I gave her the permission. Anytime she wanted to stop, she could come out. She was the one in control, not me.
Yeah.
But that I would be with her and encourage her. And if necessary, if she needed a light, we can take a light with us. See? That was the idea that Jung said, if you go into the shadow, always take a light.
It sounds a bit like Jung's active imagination as well in this process.
And so it took a while because naturally, this was a big issue that had plagued her since she was a little girl. She was always afraid of the dark. And she didn't know why she was afraid. And this has persisted right into her mid-50s. And it came up, the issue came up when she was on retreat. When nighttime came, she wanted to leave her retreat room and go outside. She didn't want to be alone in the dark, see? So she would like to go out and walk around outside where there was some life, you see. And so when she was asked to stay in the room for her retreat, she said, I'm afraid, you see. So that was the problem. So in the waking dream, we pursued this until eventually she landed in the bottom of this chasm. And we sat there. We sat there for a while. And then the feeling slowly of terror began to ease. And then she began to feel a little more safe, a little more comfortable. And then finally, she saw an Egyptian scarab right at her feet.
That's a nice image.
And the scarab was green, a brilliant emerald green. And this spoke to me because this is a classical image of transformation. Yeah. What we were going through in this short, brief period was a transformation experience. And so the next step was to actually concentrate on the scarab and then to pick up the scarab and hold it in her hands and see what she felt, what was the felt experience. And that immediately she began to feel energy in the sacrum center. So the energy started to, shall we say, fizz like champagne. Mm-hmm. And from my experience of working with people, this is quite a typical response, that when there is a connection with the body, the felt sense, you sense the energy there.
Exactly. It's so dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can feel it in yourself as well as...
Now, the beauty of the technique is that none of this involves anything cognitive.
Yeah.
Yes.
It involves only the use of imagination, which is important because, there's a psychiatrist called Ian McGilchrist who wrote quite a volume on the idea of the left brain and the right brain, and how the left brain tends in our society to be dominant. And so what it dominates is the right brain, which is more connected with imagination. And his title of the book was The Master and His Emissary.
Yes.
And the idea was that the emissary takes over from the master. And who is the master? It is essentially you, taken over by your mind.
Exactly.
So that becomes, you see, the no-no when it comes to dream work and working with the imagination, that you have to be very careful to direct the person back to the felt sense in the body. Often the person will start talking and then they'll go off in a narrative or a fantasy, which actually is a kind of dissociation.
Yeah. Do you often find, I've noticed this, that when someone's presenting the dream and you're going to work with it, with the waking dream technique, there's always an image that represents the mind somewhere in there, which can be so tempting if you go towards, but then you've lost, you're away from the body at that point.
Yeah, it can be as an image, as often is, but also it is often the way the person interprets the dream in the moment.
Yeah.
During the dream.
Yes.
That often is what we say the ego perspective. And there's always a surprise when you work with the dream and the person discovers it's not what they thought it was. See? So, for example, to give you a more extreme example, I worked with one student. He wasn't my client, but it was a student in a dream group. And she had great difficulty coming out of her head. It was always filled with the theme why. And so she had this dream in which somebody, another man, was in the process of cutting her head off.
Lovely.
And that, of course, the point
Pretty transformative.
she woke up, you see, and she said, well, what does that mean? so a bit impish by saying, well, that's good news. She said, well, what do you mean? So I said, well, let's work with it. See? And we went into the visualization. I said, let's go into the dream. We first established the background, like the scene, the setting, and the atmosphere. And then we engaged with the body. Where do you feel the atmosphere in your body? And then we began with the dream work, which is, now what you see, there's this man there, and he's about to cut my head off. And I'm sort of bowed over in the position of being beheaded. So I said, well, let's just trust the dream that this is not some kind of suicidal or masochistic fantasy. This actually is perhaps coming from a wiser place in you that might be helpful. And at any point, you can stop. If you feel frightened, if you feel uncomfortable or disturbed, just say so, and we'll stop and look at that. See? So we had a good relationship, so she trusted me. And the man began to saw her head off. And she said, it feels fine. I feel okay. I've lost my head. See? So there's a strange paradox. How would you be able to think and speak or imagine if you didn't have a head? Well, perhaps there's another reason. In other words, there's something else there, which is what is behind the head, or what's activating the head, which is the mind. Mm-hmm. And so the mind, in a sense, was being freed from a task that had been perpetually chained to for decades. And so for the first time, she actually was lost for words.
Without a head, that's not a surprise.
The question, why did that happen, or what does that mean? And she was gobsmacked that she actually felt good. And that became a turning point for her. We noticed in the groups that she actually was more able to listen and actually sense what people were experiencing rather than analyze or point out things or question things.
I think that's a lovely example of, for me, Dave, why the waking dream technique as a piece of work is so powerful and can be so transformative.
Yeah. Yeah, if you had to think it through, you wouldn't go to that same process. No. But you experience it directly, and that allows you to be with the depth of the experience.
Well, of course, this is why. I mean, anyone listening to this who's, say, a practicing clinical professional might be alarmed in terms of what I'm suggesting, and quite rightly so, because this kind of work should only be attempted if you are an experienced and trained psychotherapist, and also that you are an experienced and trained dream worker in the waking dream technique. In other words, you've been supervised and eventually found to be quite responsible, and you have the ability to actually guide people and work with them. Because as you can see, such suggestions in the wrong hands could be dangerous.
Yeah.
So that's a warning about who should be doing this. And the second thing is who you're doing it to.
Yeah.
If you're doing it to somebody who is unstable, or somebody who's a borderline personality, or certainly somebody who's had a breakdown, or worse still, a schizophrenic breakdown, or any kind of breakdown, it is a contraindicated because the job there is to build the person's sense of self up rather than deconstructing it.
Exactly.
Because what I've described
splitting.
was a deconstructing process. It actually was lifting out the defense of the mind that was constantly obstructing the client from actually feeling things deeper down.
Yeah.
I think from a psychoanalytic point of view, it has a long sort of grounding anyway, this form of technique. I was thinking about Freud and Janet and Dessoy, Robert Dessoy as well, who I think pioneered something quite similar. I think was it called the Red Technique, which was a bit like the waking dream, directive waking dreams, I think he called it in French.
Yes, so there's many ways of working with the imagination and being directive or simply listening or just setting a theme or providing a short narrative, interacting, questioning. There are lots of different ways. We use all of those ways in the waking dream technique, which is why it takes some time to really train a person. And they need to have a lot of experience, personal experience of it, of how it works. You see.
Yeah. Could you maybe say a little bit about the history and the development of, how did you come up with it, and what were the circumstances that made you want to put together the waking dream technique?
Well, like most people, it wasn't a sudden Einsteinian flash of insight that created a revolution. It was something that gradually grew, and it came from different sources, and gradually putting it together. And so, I'd been working with dreams and also visualization way back since 1974. And by 1984, when the CCPE was begun, I had to write the course. One aspect of the course was creative imagination.
Such a great part of the course.
A wonderful 6 days of working with the imagination, full time every day. And one of the exercises was working with the body.
Yeah.
Creating body images when you go around the body, and creating body map from it, and that tells you a lot. Thinking of Bessel van der Kolk's "The Body Keeps the Score," you can see the imbalances in people and where they're ungrounded. See, for example, people will draw the figure, the human figure. And they would unconsciously leave the feet off. See, so they're straight away tells you this person's ungrounded. And I incorporated the technique of Eugene Gendlin, which is following the felt sense when you're working with the imagination. It's a powerful technique. He simply used it as a clinical psychologist to help people just access the deeper feeling that was going on in them. See, using the trick of the felt sense lets go of the mind and the thinking, and then comes the imagination, and then you understand what it's about. So I used that. So that was, if you like, the next step. And then the next step after that was from a very long profound retreat I experienced in 1989, or 88. And in this retreat, I experienced not just a heart opening, but a complete experience of the light body. And in that experience, which went on for 30 days, my consciousness was moving from level to level of consciousness. And what I was experiencing, each level I was encountering was a different face or different figure of a woman. And I was reminded of what Jung was saying, for a man, their anima speaks to them as they're moving. And it suddenly occurred to me, the dream is able to track, dreams are able to track your process of change, particularly on retreat, because retreat is a very intensive transformation process. Unlike psychotherapy, which is a longer, less intense process. It can take place over years. But a retreat is a short, concentrated time.
And I think you do yours in silence as well, don't
And
you?
they're done in silence, as solo retreats, you see, with a guide. And
30 days is a long time
yes,
as well.
well, that was
Retreat, Nigel.
yeah. Well, I built up to that, so
Develop the retreat muscle.
yes, and eventually it goes on to 40 days, so where you fast as well.
Biblical.
But actually, the people say, "Oh, I don't dream." And the moment they come on retreat, they begin to dream. In other words, they begin to remember their dreams, because we always do dream. As I mentioned in the last podcast, we always do.
Yeah.
But the dream becomes a wonderful chance then to explore it with the retreatant as to what they're experiencing and what it might relate to, and therefore perhaps suggest some kind of meditative practice that will help them to assimilate or work with that issue. So that became the next step. And then in 1994, I began the idea of bringing Eugene Gendlin's felt sense into the dream work itself. Up to that point, I worked with it in creative imagination, but it was a particular exercise.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, rather than it being left put into dreams.
And so in 1995, I started our first dream courses, in which we're taught this technique of, I called it the waking dream technique. See? And then, to cut a long story short, 2008, I prepared the first draft of the book, which later was published as Awakening in Dreams.
Yeah.
So that's a potted history.
Yeah, really fascinating, isn't it? And it's so well developed now, as Dave and I know. We've both been on varying courses and learnt the technique. I was just thinking, have you, Dave, got any examples of how you've used it recently or like to use it?
Well, as you know, I teach on a course on dream work at the DRI and CCPE. And so every week we're using it with people in exactly the way that I was taught. But also, I did my dissertation research, as you know, on the waking dream process and its clinical effectiveness. And, it showed that it's an effective therapeutic technique, and particularly around well-being scores for people. And I just wondered how you think that it measures up against other psychotherapy approaches and interventions.
Well, the problem with assessing the effectiveness of any therapeutic technique is that it doesn't always take into account the subjective aspect.
Yeah.
When you try to be objective, in other words, you want to have a body of people who act as the sort of reference point, and then you test out some people, select them randomly, you test out, and you perhaps use a number of therapists to work with. Well, you've got so many subjective factors. All you get is a sort of an average effect. And when they do that, they find there's very little differences between different ways of working. And I would suspect it might even apply to the waking dream technique. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't claim it to be a miracle in itself, but it's the person who's using it is the key. Mm-hmm. For example, we know from research, in psychotherapy research, that it is the quality of feeling and the quality of the relationship and the way the therapist works with the client that actually is the most important thing. It's not so much the technique.
Yeah.
So the same would apply to the waking dream technique. So if you want to evaluate it, you have to pick your best worker and pick the clients that actually are more suited to imaginal work, and then have it compared with some other technique that they pick their best therapist. They pick the client would be suitable for that. In other words, you're beginning to compare things on a level playing field. See? You're actually accounting for the subjective. In other words, you're using it to the best advantage.
On the other hand, I know from using it, and of course I have a psychotherapy practice where I work with people in lots of different ways, and it does feel like the very fact that it gets below that cognitive level of consciousness, it allows things to loosen up and allows things to move forward more quickly with the client from a subjective perspective as the therapist. And I think I've heard you talk about that before. Is that your view on it?
Yeah, this is what I call the process of turning within. Our consciousness is normally focused on the world outside. We're taught that if you want to grow up and learn how to socialize and get a job, that's what you have to do. If you remain in yourself, you're considered partly autistic, or you don't communicate. And we do this so well that, of course, people lose the ability to actually turn within, to actually be conscious of their inner world, their inner feelings. At least for most people, I would say. Sometimes artists are the exception. They're able to access something deeply, much deeper in the zeitgeist of the time, or in the collective unconscious of people. But for the most of us, our cognitive thinking dominates. That's what we said earlier. There was the emissary, which is the mind, dominates the master, which is your sense of being. And so when the conscious mind and the cognitive thinking dominates, the only reality is that which is outside. The moment you let go of that way of thinking and prepare to sit and wait in the emptiness in other words, the emptiness of conscious thought, you then begin to turn within. So, for example, there's an old saying, mysticism begins when the mind stops.
Right. So we're back to losing the head again.
Yeah.
Right, well, I'm thinking that we perhaps now go for a dream of the week.
Great. Dream of the week. On we go.
I'm going to bring for the dream of the week a dream from a client that's given me permission to talk about their dream, and it was one that we actually did work on this week. And so a brief context of the dream, this client is on the cusp of a life change. They've decided to go back to study computer science at OU. They are 40. They've been working very successfully for a long time within the IT industry, but they didn't have a degree at the start when they left college, and went and just basically, sort of found their way into the IT industry. And he's decided that he's taking some time out to actually start a proper university course in computer science. So that's the context of the dream. So in the dream, he finds himself in a fairground that he recognizes from childhood. And he has very fond memories of this fairground. And it's his childhood was quite lonely, but the fairground was full of life and fun. And in the fairground, he meets a childhood friend who he actually hasn't seen since childhood. But the friend has grown up and he recognizes him. And they have a brief chat together. And then the client wanders around the varying rides. And there's a food stall, which he goes and he gets some food. And then he moves on, and there is another stall, which is basically features a massive computer. When he asks the man running the computer on this stall, he says it's called Colossus. And obviously there was a famous computer called Colossus, but also my client has a Greek background. So there's also the notion that through association, the Colossus of Rhodes. Anyway, scientist is a bit of a boffin. He's got a clipboard. He's in charge. And my client then wakes up. So how I worked with the dream, but I'm obviously keen to get some input here. How I worked with the dream was we obviously went back into the dream through meditation, and he encountered the fairground and some memories of childhood through the fairground. This time around, we started a conversation with the childhood friend, and the friend, let's call him Kevin. The client remembers him being warm and friendly and relaxed, and in the dream, that's how he finds this particular friend, and they spend the time going through the fairground together within the waking dream technique, which felt important that he wasn't by himself. And obviously, for me, the friend felt like a guide in some way through this old space. So we have the childhood where he didn't go to university, and then we meet obviously the stall with this massive computer. The food stall felt important. He bought some food and he ate the food from the food stall, which in alchemical terms we would call coagulatio. So something was being earthed and grounded by eating the food and taken in, exactly. And then we worked with the boffin, and the client needed to see that the friend offered him qualities. He knows himself that he can get very geeky. And so the friend offered qualities of, during this new period in his life, of learning how to make it fun and easygoing, which the fairground and the friend represented. And so, again, using the waking dream technique as you talk, Nigel, we found where he kept that in his body. And I think you'd like this. He found it in his solar plexus, which felt so important. Obviously, it's a center of energy. It's just below the diaphragm, round the belly button, for those of you who don't know where the solar plexus is. And it is our powerhouse. And it's where, transformation can happen and energy gets stored. And so it felt a very important part of him finding this new part of himself in the solar plexus area. So as part of, as you've taught me, Nigel, I set it as a meditation practice for him to do now, between now and the next session. Each day sit with that new energy and put his hand on the solar plexus and just sit with it. So that's how I worked with it. But obviously I'm very keen to hear what you two have to say about it, as it's our dream of the week.
Well, I wouldn't have done anything very different from what you did. I think you did the right thing. Remember, the solar plexus as a energy center, I've come to experience, is the where the sense of self is felt.
Yeah,
I know the sense of self, we think about it in our mind, but where you feel it in the energy body is around the solar plexus.
And he did say when he contacted it during the exercise, he felt the fizzing that you talked about.
And so the fizzing would be indicative of something's changing in the sense of self. Yeah. Yes, the felt sense is changing, but that corresponds, as the energy is changing, it corresponds to the actual realization of how he's changing, which is more to do with the mind. Yeah. See? So that's one thing I would note. I'm curious, I would ask you, was he actually lonely, or did he not have a lot of friends as a child?
He had friends, but he was an only child. And his father wasn't fully part of his life. So he was predominantly brought up by his mother and his grandparents. So friends at school were quite important for him. But when he went home, I think there was a loneliness.
Did he spend a lot of time at home on his own, for example, fiddling with computers or reading about computers or anything like that?
When he was older, yes. Yeah.
So that became his inner world.
Yeah.
And so what the dream is showing is that, yes, he's having to open up as a human being into something that's more human, not just computer human, but not just an AI person, but a human being. You see, so I think that's quite significant as a change for him.
Yes, he's in a newfound group of friends as well, and living in a new part of the UK. And he's re-establishing himself actually very successfully there, and the change has been good for him.
Yeah, and I would suspect, I don't know if has a relationship in any way.
Yeah, he has. He's in a new relationship, and which feels really nourishing for him and very successful.
Okay, all right. So I don't know if Dave, you wanted to.
Well, maybe just riffing a little bit on some of what you were saying, because I'm interested that, so the client is male, the friend is male as well, I take it?
Yes.
Yeah, and then there's a male scientist that's there. And you were talking about the absence or the not a very strong presence of the father in his childhood, and not an older brother because he's an only child. And here he is thinking about his career and what he wants to do in the world, which is often represented or symbolized by the father or whoever's holding that masculine sense in the family dynamic. And as well that computers, this would be my take on it, I don't know what it means to your client, but computers do represent order in some way. They're predictable. What goes in is what comes out. And there's something about that as well in the classical sense of a father and the masculine representing order and predictability, as opposed to what might be the more spontaneous creative side that's sustained and supported by maybe the maternal.
Yeah, I really like that as well, because I was thinking of some of the Jungian modern Jungian thought about the static masculine position being the sort of authority in the father, and I was thinking of the work of Gareth S. Hill, which that reminds me of. And there's something about the friend that is a very different masculine approach as a guide, that it's fun and relaxed and
something a little bit more balanced, which is always the key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, what I'd say is that, of course, the feminine is absent.
Yes.
And that's significant. Not that that's the bad thing at the moment, but that would be the next step to begin to look for the presence of the feminine in the dreams. In other words, there's something deeper, which is more connected to his essence, that is emerging. See, so because it begins with the idea of having fun, because when we are very young, having fun is an expression of something deeper in us. It's not something trivial. When a child is deprived of having fun, there's something quite sad about that.
Yeah.
That the child can never really actually begin to have an optimistic outlook on life. So it's very important that play the child is introduced to play, because it comes naturally. You don't have to teach the child how to play. If you look at the animals, young dogs will play, cats will play. So it's not just instinctive. I would say it's essential. You see? And so that's why I say that's the beginning, through that imagery of being in the fairground. But what it can lead to is, in the future, hopefully, the appearance of the feminine. And I think that will mark an even bigger change in his life.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for adding to that interpretation. And,
thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Laura.
And thank you to the client for allowing us to discuss it in that way.
Yes,
and
indeed.
It brings us to an end. So, Nigel, once again, really appreciate you dropping into the Dreamboat and giving us some of your wisdom, and particularly around the waking dream technique. I know it's something that you have really pioneered, and I know using it as a therapist and also being part of dream groups that you have hosted it, the waking dream technique has made a massive difference to my own life.
Yeah, and now you've trained generations of therapists and dream workers now, and people like us who have run dream groups and now are the people that we've taught and worked with are out there and working with the waking dream process themselves. So there's a real legacy there that we need to thank you for as well. And just to say to the listeners, you may have noticed there's a little bit of background noise today.
The outside world.
Yeah, we're recording in the boat pod, and it happens to be in the middle of the Waterways Festival at Little Venice. So there are dozens of narrow boats around on the canals and smaller boats zipping in between as they get ready for tomorrow. So it's a really festive atmosphere, but occasionally there's a motor going by outside our little boat here. But thank you for listening. And just to remind you that you can join the DRI for just £10 a year until the end of June 2023. And there you can get access to more content, including videos and discounts for our events. It's a great way of finding out more about our work and joining our dream community and supporting this podcast. So there's details in the show notes and at driccpe.org.uk/membership. Thank you very much for listening. Keep dreaming and keep sharing your dreams.
So, thank you for joining us for this week's episode. Don't forget to like us and leave comments on your favourite podcast platform. As I'm sure you know, that's the way we build an audience for the Dreamboat podcast and also to spread news about dreaming. And as we said, there are many ways you can share your dreams at the DRI, the Dream Research Institute.
Yes, we have courses, events, and workshops, and we want to hear from you. So check out the show note for links, or find us on Instagram as the Dreamboat Podcast, on our Facebook page as Dreamboat Podcast, on Twitter as @DreamboatPod, or come and find us at driccpe.org.uk. That's driccpe.org.uk. And you can email us on driinfo@ccpe.org.uk. Once again, that's driinfo@ccpe.org.uk. And if you want to explore your dreams further, or would like to support us, you can join the DRI as a member for just £10 a year. Yes, £10 a year. As a member, you will get discounts for our events and short courses. You'll get our newsletter with the latest dream research news, and we will also be adding other special member benefits during the year. Of course, members' dreams will always be given preference for reading on the podcast Dream of the Week slot. This low offer of £10 membership will last through to the end of June 2023. So go to the link on the show notes and become a DRI member today. Keep dreaming and keep sharing your dreams.